you please come up and introduce your panel? Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again, Peter. Congratulations to Al Ula. Looks like they're doing a wonderful, wonderful development job there, and beautiful narration. So we are here in Nîmes, and we are going to be focused with our panel on business travel and whether or not it can and how it is being measured for sustainability and efficiency. So why is the first thing? Why are we even talking about having to measure business travel for sustainability and efficiency? So I just want to set the scene by saying that COP27 is just over a week away in November. And as politicians prepare, they are preparing at the same time to show and demonstrate their green credentials. And many of the governments around the world, the signatories of the Paris Agreement, focus on business to deliver on their sustainability goals. And business, therefore, the business community is keen on demonstrating their green credentials. And what they do is they look at their supply chain, and they force their supply chain to help them to deliver on those green credentials, including their executives. When they travel on business, their executives are asked to ensure that their hotels that they stay in, the flights that they take, or other modes of transport that they use are all going to fulfill their sustainability goals. So if our industry, the tour operators, the travel agents, the hotels, the airlines, if they want that business, they have to prove and demonstrate their green credentials. So this is why we're here talking about how and what is it that we are going to be measuring for sustainability and efficiency to demonstrate these green credentials to this corporate customer world. I wanted to start with Charles Feld from Grayling. I won't go into their bios too much because I want to make sure that we stick to our time for this panel. And please look him up, but you'll see that he has a vast knowledge of experience about regulation, policy making, and particularly the European Union. And I wanted to start with you, Charles. Is the EU looking at business travel? What kind of questions are they asking? Are they actually measuring our impact? What about the IPCC targets? How are the EU looking at our performance versus IPCC targets? Tell us a little bit about this regulatory context from the EU perspective.
Thank you very much, Ufi, and it's great to be here. So as you said, we've been looking quite closely at the regulatory framework and everything that's happening right now at the European level, in particular. And what's happening right now is that the European Union is redefining what sustainability means, how it needs to be assessed, and applied to different sectors. So there are a lot of new regulations that are coming our way. Some of them are horizontal and apply to all business sectors, and some of them are more sector specific. So maybe just a couple of examples to illustrate this trend. One piece of legislation is the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, for example, which creates new requirements for companies to disclose non-financial information relating to their impact in terms of the environment, social rights, human rights, etc. Another piece is the Corporate Sustainable Due Diligence Directive, close but not the same. And this mandates companies to actually oversee their supply chains to measure, to mitigate their impact on the environment, on communities. And so it's creating a whole new framework for due diligence. And then the third one is the taxonomy. Some of you might have heard of this. It's incredibly complicated, but it's basically a new financial framework to steer investments towards green projects by defining what a sustainable economic activity is, with specific criteria for the transport and building sector, for example. So these are just a couple of examples. There's a lot going on also regarding green claims, deforestation, and so on and so forth. All of these are not specific to the business travel sector, but they will definitely impact the travel and the business travel sector. One specific piece of legislation which is particularly relevant is the Count Emissions EU initiative, which basically aims to set a common framework for the calculation and the reporting of transport-related emissions. And for GBTA, for example, this is absolutely key. I can explain what they're expecting from this. But to your second point on the IPCC targets and how the industry is doing, it's hard, I think, to assess the overall performance of the sector just because it's fragmented and companies have more and more individual objectives and goals. A lot of them are trying to reach net zero. What we know is that aviation, for example, represents 5% of global emissions. The hospitality sector, 1%. And the transport sector in general, 25%. So it's massive, and we need to do more on that front. We also know that a lot of companies are committing to, for example, the science-based targets and have specific objectives relating to business travel. So that's good. Some of the studies that the GBTA has been doing, however, show that for 63% of the industry, basically the lack of data on emissions and the lack of reporting standards is the major hurdle for the industry to improve. And so I think that's what we should be focusing on. That's a clear call to action also to governments to help us create that predictability, that stability, that accountability for the sector. And as you said, investors are looking for that. A lot of individual companies and travel managers also have to comply with these new requirements. So hopefully some of the reluctance to share commercial sensitive data are also going to disappear because of this new regulatory push. I think that there's an alignment of the stars and real momentum to do this, so I'm quite optimistic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A very comprehensive overview. You're absolutely right. Regulation is definitely driving change in the capital markets, and therefore institutional capital, institutional investors are driving organizations like my own to develop those standards and metrics specifically for hotels, hotel assets and operational performance in order that those investors can actually report back into SFDR, into EU taxonomy and other regulatory vehicles which are aggressively coming in through the pipeline. So we feel the pressure from the EU. And certainly when we look at companies like Microsoft, for example, Microsoft have introduced a levy on their corporate executives. So if you are working for Microsoft and you want to take a business trip, you have to pay a levy to the company in order to be able to take that trip over and above everything else, a carbon-based levy, dependent on your CO2 emissions. So Microsoft is saying to their corporate customers, to their corporate clients, their executives, what's the CO2 footprint of your trip going to be? And therefore, this is the tax you have to pay if you really want to go there. Otherwise, of course, use Teams. So American Express, you have corporate clients like Microsoft, for example. This, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is Nicole Sautter from American Express Global Business Travel. And you are having to answer these questions from these global corporate clients that you have. So tell us, what types of questions are they asking you? Are they asking you to measure the carbon footprint of their trips or the broader environmental impact of the business trip that they want to take? How are you responding to that? Are you measuring, and how?
Thank you, and yes, absolutely, and thanks for having me. AMEX GBT, we work with clients globally, including SMEs and multinationals, like you said, to help them manage the sustainability of their business travel programs. We believe that travel is a force for good in the world, and it is not travel that we need to solve for, but it is the carbon emissions associated that we want to challenge, that we want to tackle. And as was just eloquently explained from both sides, yes, corporations are increasingly taking on a best practice approach, moving faster than governmental requirements on reporting, and they voluntarily set emission reduction targets, they report into science-based targets, CDP, and so forth. And what we hear loud and clear from them is, well, we have set targets, now we need to understand, to set a target, you need to first of all measure, right? You need to know what is your baseline, and then you need to understand how are we performing against those targets. And business travel, for example, for a typical professional services firm, can make up to 20% of their Scope 3 emissions. That's the second biggest category after purchased goods and services. So we must get this right for our clients. And so we've developed a suite of solutions that we call our green marketplace for business travel to help them reduce emissions associated while still continuing to do business travel. That includes things like sustainable aviation fuel, offsets, point of sale solutions. But point is, at the very core of this green marketplace is tracking and reporting carbon emissions, because we can't manage what we don't measure. And so today we do give our clients the opportunity and help them to calculate carbon emissions from business travel. A challenge is, however, that yes, we want standardization, but we also want accuracy. And what we hear from clients today is that as the sort of leading governmental methodologies that are out there often rely on proxies and average emission factors. For example, for aircraft type may not be included. And what clients want is they want to see on their balance sheet when they look at their carbon accounting that every single thing they do to improve the sustainability of their travel programs has a real effect on the bottom line. And to believe the solution is, for example, GBT, we've partnered with IATA, International Air Transport Association. They've just released a new methodology that is based on real airline operational data. But again, ideally, we have governments also, and we work together to get to a point where we achieve both accuracy and standardization.
And some of the statistics that Charles mentioned related to air travel in particular only relate to Scope 1. So it's, the numbers could be much, much worse. If we take into consideration scopes 2 and 3. But before we dive in, rather than dive into that, I just wanted to come back to you on business travel. So if your corporate clients are asking you all these questions and they are, just reframing your words, they are keeping balance sheets on their carbon performance, is that having an impact on the volume of business travel that you are seeing? Tell us what's happening in the business travel world. Is it growing?
Well, obviously we've had a pandemic which was, heavily, strongly impacted business travel, as we know, we heard this morning. And, business travel pandemic has also brought a degree of flexibility, right? A flexibility around working from home, virtual working, which we absolutely welcome. However, we've also heard and we hear from clients loud and clear they're dying to go back on the road, to shake hands and to do business. So in that sense, we don't see necessarily that there's not going to be a strong recovery that we're expecting for business travel. What we do see, though, is that during the recovery, businesses have actually used that time to focus on sustainability and their balance sheets. And they've come out asking us to help them be more sustainable in their travel. And so really it has had an effect on how we travel. And our clients have become more educated in that regard. And they're challenging us, for example, with saying, your carbon calculation from UK government DEFRA, for example, is great that we're using now, but we want something more accurate, help us. And so we're being challenged more, that is what we find.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're talking about significant structural change in global business travel. Now, Agnes Decramer from ATR Cube, you'll have to tell the story about what Cube means, I like that story, and also co-founder and CEO of Feelingo. You represent an association among all these three titles that you have of tour operators here in France. And on their behalf, you are doing a slightly similar role to that which Nicole is doing for their corporate clients. You are helping them to measure their impact on sustainability and efficiency related to business travel. Tell us a little bit more about what you are doing and how you are doing it.
Thanks a lot for inviting me first. Maybe some of you know the association ATR in French, Agir pour un tourisme responsable, Act for Responsible Tourism. The purpose of the association is to gather mainly tour operators today, but tomorrow we want to expand and enlarge the type of partner members we will gather, so not only tour operators, but also destination management company, accommodation groups, chains, and actually all the players of the industry. The purpose of ATR is to help the professional first to measure their impact, that's the purpose of the discussion today, but not only to measure, then to act, reducing their impact and compensating their impact. I would like to talk about this hot topic of compensation, which is, from my point of view and from the point of view of ATR, it's a short-term solution, but clearly not a long-term solution. Reduction is the solution. And what we offer to our member, it's a tool that was designed by Voyageurs du Monde. Voyageurs du Monde is a French tour operator, that is deeply involved in sustainable tourism since a while. And the tool was developed based on the carbon database of the French Agency for Ecological Transition, l'ADEME in French. Again, I'm sorry if the translation is not right, but I guess you know what it is. So from this carbon database, we developed a tool aiming to calculate the emission from transportation, but also accommodations. Still, there is a lack of information on what we call the land activity, so what we're going to do on spot. And here we are directly working with the professional to see how we can help them to evaluate the impact of the land activity. But all the members of ATR have access to this tool, can calculate their own impact and also the impact of the travel they are designing, in order not only to measure, but of course then to compensate at first, short-term solution, and then work on reducing the impact of their travel. And today I'm happy to also tell you that we are working together with AWFT to measure your own impact and the impact of this event. So you will receive, or you maybe already receive, an email asking you, okay, how did you come here? Where are you staying? What did you do on spot, maybe? And we will work closely with the forum to calculate our global emission and the emission of this event, and see in 2023 how we can reduce the emission of this event, and of course propose alternative for the forum to come.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Agnes. Now, I must say that France seems to be a leader in many respects, particularly the regulators in France with all the schemes that you mentioned, work that they're doing on driving their businesses to measure and calculate and report on their CO2 emissions in hotels, for example, per square meter, per kilowatt hour. And also, of course, we know that France was one of the first countries in the world to decide to let's say, put people off flying internally, where there are alternative rail routes available. So real leadership there, and it's great to see that you are one of the leading lights within the country as well. Thank you. Now we turn to Helen Usher, who is the co-founder and chief executive of Animondial. Now, Helen, you're an advocate of nature-positive approaches to measuring business travel, and within that, to actually integrate the broader environmental impacts, particularly biodiversity. So why is this so important at the moment? Why is it important now over and above CO2, particularly given the pressures on reporting on CO2 and emissions levels? Why now should we be thinking about biodiversity impacts? And how would we go about measuring them in a business travel trip? For example, how should Agnes include biodiversity impacts in reporting on this conference and our impact?
Thank you very much. Well, gosh, that's quite a lot to answer. I'll try and remember all the points. But
I'll remind you, don't worry.
Absolutely.
We'll take them one by one.
So I think the first thing to just reinstate, as you mentioned, that biodiversity loss is actually a huge driver of climate change. And, I think most of us would be aware of that, but just haven't really considered that piece. In the travel and tourism industry, or in many other industries, actually, we've not connected the dots between the two. So it's really vitally important that, in fact, it's critical that we put biodiversity protection on the same level as reducing carbon emissions. They really should be tackled together. The challenge is that obviously we don't have that one sort of cohesive, way of looking at that or reporting on it or measurement tool, but hopefully we will get there. The reason why it's so important right now, we know that we've got less than 8 years effectively to hit our 2030 goals and for net zero. And as I just mentioned, we won't achieve those just from reducing emissions. So we really need to focus on this area. We've got COP15 occurring in December. So this is the Conference of Parties that focuses on biodiversity. So it's where global governments and business leaders will come together and discuss what they will be doing, what actions they'll be taking, we hope, we pray, in order to put this area on the agenda. So it's really the first time that businesses have actually been given access to such forums as well. We've got NGOs going, so it's fantastic to see again that everyone's coming together to have a piece to say. And with that, we're working on an important topic, well, we're working on an important project with the World Travel and Tourism Council, which is the nature positive approach. And that will be actually taken to COP15, which is very exciting. It's been taken into proceedings where we'll actually be asking for leaders to support the travel and tourism sector in delivering upon this. And I think bringing this back to business travel is really, really key because, as you mentioned earlier on, we really do have that opportunity to be working with companies, across all sectors. So this is an important touch point that we have with that. So therefore, global business travel can really make a huge impact, not just travel and tourism alone. This is actually reaching other sectors as well. And again, reflecting the point you made earlier, if this is going to be a key part of sustainability agendas now going forward, so, again, looking at ESG, environment, this will form a key part of this, and it already is, and it is for many other industries. So if we're going to be looking at business travel solutions, we need to make sure that we are aligning with the commitments of all companies of all shapes and sizes and supporting them in their commitment to protect animals and nature as well as reducing carbon.
But how do we measure our impact on biodiversity?
Yeah.
This is, this panel is specifically asking, how do we measure our impact on sustainability and efficiency? So how does that relate to biodiversity?
It's a tricky one, but actually if you focus it back to the drivers of biodiversity loss, and I think that's where we need to sort of make sure that all of the various ones of us out there that are looking at this measurement come together and agree on how we're going to do this again, so it's consistent, so everyone knows where to go and we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. But effectively it's looking at those touch points with nature and those drivers of biodiversity loss. We've got, in fact, climate change is one of them, of course, as I've mentioned, pollution, individual animals, invasive species, and then changing use of sea and land, which is huge. So going back to what we were mentioning earlier on, and obviously your area is a focus, and with this conference, it would be looking at, okay, so around this hotel, for example, how are we impacting on nature? You'd be surprised at the little elements that we're not aware of, and again, it's thinking of, as you mentioned, along those touch points of the journey to come here, if we've come by rail or air, what are we doing, how is that actually affecting biodiversity? Because all of those will be adding to the challenge. So it's just adding those forms of measurement along, but currently there isn't really an interconnected piece to make sure the two are combined.
Yes, well, from a built environment point of view, companies like Briam Lee do actually integrate biodiversity into the broader environmental, social and governance measures. But you're absolutely right. The whole point of biodiversity loss is frightening, actually, when you look at the numbers. WWF report recently saying that we've already lost 69% of biodiversity on the planet, which is frightening if you consider that our global population is growing, and all the signs show that the majority of that loss is related to anthropogenic, i.e. human activity. And also similar numbers for insects, for example, which are so key to pollination, i.e. food security for us and life on Earth. And significant losses there, also higher than 50%. So very alarming numbers are being reported. So we wish COP15 meetings in December well and see what will come out of that. Now let's turn to solutions, because if we stick with these challenges, we could all get very depressed, and we want to be very optimistic and energized going forward to tackle these issues. Nicole, I'd like to start with you, if I may. Now I know that American Express are a very big supporter and promoter for sustainable aviation fuels. How important are sustainable aviation fuels to the solutions? And how far are we from cost-effective and environmentally sound business travel? Because ultimately, you know, there are many destinations from which we couldn't get here unless we fly.
Yeah, absolutely. And to answer, first of all, from a global level, aviation today accounts for about 3% of carbon emissions. And that doesn't sound like much, but the aviation sector is also generally considered a hard-to-abate sector, meaning compared to other sectors, it is considered very difficult or more difficult to decarbonize it. For example, because of the long lifespan of airplanes and because it's just generally more expensive. If we bring it home to AMEX GBT and our clients, we know that over 90% of emissions from their overall travel programs comes from air. So for AMEX GBT, it's one of our key areas of focus to help accelerate the decarbonization of the aviation sector through SAF. And if you look at SAF, it is widely considered the most viable solution today to help us achieve emission reductions in aviation. Why? Because it is already today available and scalable. It is what we call a drop-in solution. It can be blended with fossil-based jet fuel. So we will have all heard of, you know, electric and hydropropulsion, such important technologies. But for those to work at scale, we need to change the entire infrastructure on aircraft and at airports. And with SAF, we don't have to do that. And to your question, how far are we? Well, this all sounds great, then what's the problem, right? The problem is that SAF has been around for years. The technology is not science fiction, it's there. But still today, less than 0.01% of flights actually operate on SAF. And that is because we have still a great price premium for SAF that is due compared to fossil-based jet fuel. And that has caused what we call a deadlock between supply and demand, where because of the relatively high price, we don't have enough demand for SAF. Because we don't have enough demand, the producers of SAF don't produce more. We need more production to bring the price down. And we believe that the business travel sector specifically has a really important role to play in helping to unlock this deadlock, because it is a highly concentrated sector, and as we've heard now, corporations are actively looking for decarbonization solutions, which is why we have a partnership with Shell Aviation at the moment, where we combine the corporate demand for SAF with the purchasing power on the airline side that Shell Aviation supply with fuel. The idea is that airlines and corporations co-invest in SAF, thereby they spread the green premium, the price premium, but both parties, airlines and corporations, benefit from the environmental reductions. And to your point about where are we at, we are still at an infancy, but we're hoping that business models like ours will help to scale it.
So this might be an unfair question to ask you, but I can't resist. How much is it going to cost to transition to sustainable aviation fuels for the global aviation industry? What's the cost?
I wish I had a number in my pocket here written down. I don't have a number, but the point is it will cost. It will cost. And the point is we need investment. We know that we are halfway, right halfway between when the Paris Agreement was signed and 2030, which is when governments have decided or agreed that we will have halved emissions. And IPCC tells us we're not on track. So yes, it will cost, but the point is, let's work with the sectors that are willing to pay for this, and that is the business travel sector, because it's in their interest. They have their own targets to report against, and as well as the airlines. So it will cost. Let's bring together the players that are willing to pay for it.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to you on this, but I want to turn to Charles. So Charles, there is a figure that I hear floating around, which is that transitioning the world to renewable energy is going to cost an additional $8 trillion. And of course, governments like the EU are looking to the private sector to make that investment and that transition. So tell us, when it comes to sustainable aviation fuels, what is the EU's view on that? Is that also one that the private sector needs to pick up the ticket? Or is there any appetite that you're seeing in the EU or among the member states individually to actually support the major investment that's going to be needed to make this possible, to make it a reality?
Yes, definitely. This is very high on the agenda in Brussels. So I think that there's a real awareness amongst decision makers on the need to speed things up to promote the uptake of SAFs. So Nicole shared a couple of facts and figures, but right now the aviation sector represents slightly more than 14% of CO2 emissions in the EU. but SAFs are not sufficiently developed. We only have around 100,000 tons of SAF that are currently produced, and 0.05% of flights are actually using this technology right now. So we really have to do better. And I think that the European Commission is aware of that. And so it's trying to act on two fronts. First, support supply, and then support demand. So one of the key initiatives that it's put forward as part of the European Green Deal, the climate law and the Fit for 55 package, is a new SAF mandate for aviation companies and airports. It's called Refuel EU Aviation, and it basically sets new targets for the industry, starting at 2% of SAF in 2025 and ramping it up to 63% of SAF, at least 63% by 2050. And the way they're doing that is basically obligating aviation companies to use this technology, obligating airports to develop the infrastructure for bunkering, but also by considering a book and claim system, for example, to add more flexibility to the mix. And so this is a key initiative, really, for the sector, because that's how we're going to manage the uptake of these fuels. On the other hand, the EU is also revising its carbon market, which already covers aviation, and through measures like, for example, giving out 20 million free allowances to support SAFs, is also trying to drive that change at the scale and at the speed that's needed. So a lot is going on right now in Brussels. Both these files are in the final stages of the negotiations. We call them the trialogues. So we're hoping that maybe by the end of the year they'll be finalized. And as you were saying, some countries are obviously front runners also in that field. Big companies like Neste, for example, I know are very active on that front. So to answer your question, yes, this is a priority, and EU decision makers are putting a lot of time and effort to make it work.
But they're expecting the customer to pick up the ticket, so to speak,
So
financially.
Yes, that's the other part of your question, and it's a fair point. I think that indeed this might lead to an increase in cost. We have to acknowledge that. But the European Commission also knows that it needs the private sector. So these frameworks are being developed also jointly with the industry to make sure that they're fit for purpose. And one thing that's also happening right now in Brussels is the launch of all these public-private partnerships to make sure that the industry can also provide feedback, best practice, and that we make sure that there's no discrepancy between the regulation and the reality. So the European Commission, for example, launched a new alliance on sustainable and alternative fuels, which is closely related to the two pieces of legislation that I mentioned. Another one on green hydrogen. These are just a couple of examples of how the private sector is being associated to all this.
So the sourcing and scaling of the feedstocks for sustainable aviation fuels, both biofuels and green hydrogen, and doing so in a commercially viable way, are still very problematic. In fact, there are still issues around methane release, for example, and methane is more potent than CO2 when it comes to global warming. So how are we going to overcome these real problems to make sustainable aviation fuel a reality in terms of scaling it up and providing that source feed? And I mean, what is the latest innovation? Give us some optimism here, Nicole.
Yes, happy to.
Yes.
Optimism, yes, please.
Optimism,
We need
please.
optimism.
Tell us, what are the latest innovations in this area? Is it
Yes.
looking real? Because all we're reading about is these significant questions around, but hang on a second, how much land use can we take away from agriculture when we already have food security issues on the planet to be able to grow the crops for this area? Are we going to see more deforestation, more palm forests destroyed? Are we going to see, and there's all sorts of problems related to green hydrogen, which we're seeing, which is why at the moment green hydrogen itself requires huge investment to make that a reality. So tell us, what's happening? What's the latest innovation in this area? Who's leading the way?
Happy to. Firstly, I would reiterate my point from earlier that unless we invest in SAF today, if it's the private sector, if it's the public sector, producers of SAF right now, and there's only maybe 3 or 5 in the world today, producers of SAF won't produce more. And if they don't produce more, they won't get better at it. We need to produce more and more SAF, and that SAF will get better and better. And so will the sustainability credentials associated with it. Our pilot program or our SAF program we currently have, we have 1 million gallons of SAF right now available, and that is SAF based on waste cooking oils. There's so SAF that is not based on agricultural waste, but there's various different feedstocks, of course, that is being used right now to produce SAF. And on the waste cooking oils, there's only so much McDonald's fries we can eat to create enough waste cooking oils to.
So you're promoting that we eat more McDonald's
No,
fries?
please
huh?
don't. Let's all be healthy. But the point is that as we get better and better, and as we invest, as we have seen it with renewable energy, we continue to invest, and SAF is in an infancy, which means we're going to get better at it. We invest, we learn by doing, we'll become more efficient, and there will be more and more generations being unlocked of SAF. And eventually, hopefully, we will get to a point where we only use synthetic fuels, meaning SAF that is not based on any biomass. In the meantime, however, we need governments, we need regulation, and we need organizations to step up and certify the SAF that we're using. And that is happening today. There are organizations like Roundtable Sustainable Biofuels, for example, that will certify SAF. But government certainly has a role to play. And on innovation, just one last point, we already heard book and claim from Charles, such an important mechanism, because SAF right now only really physically exists in California and selected countries in Europe. So for our program, we're using a book and claim approach, which is quite common in the industry, which means we're decoupling the physical SAF from its environmental attributes. And that means everyone in the world, even if SAF is not at your local airport, can invest in SAF today and still benefit from the environmental reductions.
Absolutely, but that seems that's going to take time.
The scaling, do you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. That is literally the point.
Give me an idea.
Of time. It totally depends on how much we invest, which is why I'm here, which is why, we're shouting about it from the rooftop. We need to invest in it.
Okay, well, so we're talking about a big prize, which requires big investment. Let's talk about some quick wins, because realistically, we need to be making some significant changes if we're to achieve the IPCC targets and global government targets of reducing our emissions by 50% by 2030. So I'm going to turn to Agnes and Helen. What are the quick wins? What can we do now? Agnes, what are you telling your tour operators? Tell us what they're doing. What solutions are they working on?
Just to come back on what was said before, I'm not a SAF expert, so I would not dare to go into detail, but I was asking myself the question, how long it will take, because it seems that we don't have time to wait for it. Probably it's part of the solution. As I say, I'm not the expert, so for sure, it may be part of the solution, but we need to move faster. And I'm worried that we don't have time to wait that SAF became worldwide, a massive solution used by every airlines. And I'm also not a EU expert, but I'm also wondering why SAF is on top of the discussion and we are not discussing about how to develop trains in Europe. Luckily, we are one of the continent which is pretty well equipped in terms of train and infrastructures. We are pretty small, and why the investment are not focused on developing train infrastructure instead of SAF? Nothing against you, Charles, and I don't know if you have the answer to that question, and maybe they are working on it. But yeah, that's for me my questioning.
Okay, well, let's let Charles answer that question before we come back to you, Agnes, on the quick wins.
So this is also a priority. The question was on SAF, but obviously the European Union is taking a comprehensive approach to all this, and that's the purpose of the European Green Deal. So indeed, rail can be more of a quick win, and actually, the European Commission has set this very ambitious target of reducing 90% of GHG emissions in the European transport sector at large, and that obviously implies, modal shift towards rail. This has been happening in different ways. One of the headline targets for 2030 is to actually double the amount of rail traffic throughout the EU, and to do so, the European Union is, for example, working on the development of multimodality digital services to make travel more seamless, to develop digital tools to encourage business travelers to use these modes of transport. There's a real issue regarding infrastructure, obviously, because some countries have really good infrastructure. France, for example, uses a lot of rail, but the idea is to harmonize all this and to make sure that infrastructure is interoperable between the different member states. And so Europe is also actively working on the revision of what we call the Trans-European Transport Network to make sure that we actually reach these targets. So rail is very important, in particular in the business travel sector, and the European institutions are also actively working on it. Actually, last year was the European Year for Rail.
Okay, so Agnes, coming back to you then, tell us about the quick wins that you are working on with your members, for example.
At ATR, we are promoting a different way to travel, or trying to promote a different way to travel and to develop, not only promote, but develop a different way to travel. A quick win is to educate our traveler. It can seem strange to say that, and maybe it's not a quick win in your mind, but we have to realize that we need to deeply change our way of traveling and our way of building trips. That's my job, my daily job, and I'm daily talking to people building trips. We can't go anymore to Vietnam. My partner developed a company in Vietnam, so if you listen to me, he will probably laugh. We can't go and spend 7 days in Vietnam anymore, coming from France. That doesn't make any sense. We need to stay longer. And as a professional, we need to propose longer trip. And that's a challenge because we are not used to do it. The average length of stay in Vietnam, for instance, it's 12 days. So from my point of view and the point of view of the association, it's one of the things we can work on, make the trip longer. If I take a concrete example of Nomad Aventure, for example, they develop and they propose for all their trip in Europe a train alternative to plane. So both still exist, and not all the travelers are choosing to take the train to travel in Europe, but still they completely changed their production model to include a train alternative in their trip. That's demanding. That's not something easy to do. That's sometimes more costly. We also have to be honest. Train is costly. But still, it's also a way to pretty drastically reduce the emission from a trip. Then what we do on spot, and I'm very happy to be next to you, Helen, to also talk about all the other impact of a trip. Here we are focusing our discussion on carbon. That's great. Indeed. Why? Because we are able to measure carbon. Congratulations. But there is so much more impact. Waste, water. I'm not drinking oil. I'm drinking water. And here I'm pretty surprised that water is not really part of the discussion when we know that probably we will miss water before to miss oil. So waste, water, biodiversity, energy, not only related to transport, but energy in general. Here the marvelous spotlight that we have on this stage. So there is also much more to consider. And all those impacts has to be taken into consideration while building a trip. And that's also what we try to do. And I'm saying trying because it's not easy, and we are exploring solutions. We are trying to be innovative with our member. We are sharing also way of doing. Sometimes we fail, and sometimes we succeed. but we also need to take into consideration the global impact of a trip and also the positive impact. Let's be positive as you proposed. Travel is an amazing tool to open minds, to discover culture, to discover otherness, to make us richer. So it's not only carbon impact, carbon emission, damage on the biodiversity. So that's why we are still developing trips, and we think that the future of travel is beautiful, and we need to change faster, but still deeply believing that travel can make the world a better place and can help the entire world to move faster, creating all those synergies and all those exchanges between the
Absolutely. I mean, we'd need at least another 45 minutes to be able to cover all the other aspects, which is why we try to focus, and do a bit of a deep dive. But let's talk about biodiversity to end with, to sort of give us that broader perspective. Helen, some quick win solutions that this audience can take away.
Sure. I think this has got to be a multi-pronged approach and done quite quickly. As you said, we haven't got time to waste now. So what we are working on and what we're recommending is to actually look at it from all levels. So we've got to change legislation. So there is a call to action from Business for Nature that's covering all sectors again, that Travel and Tourism is also supporting, which is making it mandatory for businesses, governments to protect biodiversity. So once we've got that in place, that's obviously going to help quite substantially, and that needs to happen very quickly, hopefully at COP15 in December. But I absolutely agree at the same time, on the sort of individual level, as travel businesses, we have a big opportunity just in ourselves to make some change in terms of actually educating and inspiring people. Travel has the power to send people to new destinations, to experience, new habitats, new communities, and respect them. And I think that one of the greatest ways to change mindsets is actually the power of immersion. And we actually can do that. We can take people to these places. So that's a key part as well. And then just on an individual travel level, and we're talking to AMEX GBT about this at the moment as well, it's really working collaboratively, to use that word again, but for quick wins. So actually going through some of these bigger associations or companies such as yourselves that actually have a number of clients, and then working on leadership. So if you become the leaders in this area, biodiversity protection, you can spread that message down to them as well. And just the one other thing is that you can perhaps take away with this is, if you'd like, to sign on to a vision by the World Travel and Tourism Council, which is going to COP15 in December. So I know we've got our friends from WTTC in the audience. Actually, that is something you can do on their website that will support this call to action. And we've also got the animal footprint evaluation tool, which will be launched at the start of next year, which will help individual travel businesses to actually assess and define their impacts on nature and then take positive steps forward.
Thank you for that takeaway. We're at the end. So Charles, one takeaway. Make eye contact with someone in the audience. What can they do as the next step? And what are you going to do as your next step, starting tomorrow?
That's a tough question. I think that the main priority or call to action for me, and I know that this word has been used a lot, is obviously collaboration, but on very specific pieces of legislation, in particular at the European level. Just going back to what I mentioned earlier, the Counter Emissions EU initiative is fundamental for the sector. And what we expect from this new harmonized framework throughout Europe is that it's able to provide reliable, comparable, transparent data, that it's actually fit for purpose, that it covers pre and post travel, and that it's able to be replicated at the international level, because we need a level playing field. So focusing our efforts on pieces of legislation like this one and working together to make it work and make sure that it's what we really need, I think is the most important thing. And looking at the audience, I don't want to promote what GBTA is doing too much, but obviously we're working very closely with them, and they're organizing a sustainability summit in Brussels on the 8th of November, and it's going to be a great opportunity to continue these discussions with high-level experts and decision makers. And so I would invite everyone to continue this conversation in Brussels on the 8th.
Thank you. Agnes, your homework for the audience, please. And what homework are you going to take home with yourself?
I'm thinking.
Okay, well, we'll come to Nicole then because we're out of time. Nicole looks ready, and then I'll come back to
Yes.
you. So takeaway for the audience and takeaway for you, Nicole.
Number one takeaway, you do not have to be a self-expert to do something today. Absolutely, that's a really important point. Let incrementalism not get in the way of action today. Discussions about the perfect measurements, the perfect offsets, the perfect feedstocks. Let's focus on what we can achieve today, not on what we can't. I think there's a tendency for us to focus on the challenge ahead rather than the simple steps we can take today. Our homework as AMEX GBT, we committed to net zero by 2050. That is way too far away a goal. So we're taking actions today, such as offsetting through high integrity, high quality offsets, travel policy tweaks, renewable energy procurement, many, many things. But number one is measuring and setting targets.
And it seems very clear to me as to what you're going to be doing tomorrow and every day thereafter. Agnes?
I would say ask yourself question. Nothing is black and white, and yeah, all the sustainability topics are pretty complicated to understand. So travel with awareness, with conscious. Can I say that in English?
Of course.
Collaborate. So talk to each other. Collaborate with travel professionals, with your travelers, with your business partners, and innovate. Don't be afraid to make our job different, our industry different. It will be different, and it's a great thing. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Collaborate and innovate.
Ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. Thank my panel very, very much. And thank you all for being with us. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank Ufi and her panel. And my takeaway from that panel is something that Agnes said, which is don't forget about the water. Don't forget about the water, as they're replacing the water right here on the stage.